Hello, my children. So this is our lesson for Monday, March 16th and Tuesday, March 17th, over the microscopic structures of the skeletal system and the functions of bone. So we are moving onwards from our doctor project. Hopefully you got that turned into Summit. If you're noticing that is still red, make sure you share a link with me and post that. Just copy and paste it and put it into Summit and then submit your project. As we're moving forward, I just want to remind you that on OneNote is where you're going to be finding all of our stuff for you to go ahead and complete any work that you need to get done, and then anything that you need to submit, you'll just submit onto Summit. Also, remember to check your email and sign up for our Remind as we're moving into a little bit more online coursework. I will also be doing live streams on YouTube, so feel free to join me at our regular class time for those if you are interested in live chatting with me and you have some questions over the work we're doing. So I'm going to get right into it. First thing that we want to talk about are the functions of bone. So when we're talking about bone, a lot of times we like to think that it's not alive, but it absolutely is. There's lots of things that it does for us that we maybe take for granted. But the easiest one we think about is support and protection. So we know that our bones protect our internal organs. They provide structure, right? So our facial structure that's unique to each of us is actually based off our bones underneath. The next function we have is body movement. So bones are pretty much levers that interact with muscles and provide a rigid bar or rod and a fulcrum. And then that resistance and force for the body to use with the muscle and the bone there so that we can actually move about. The next function is blood cell formation. We call this hematopoiesis, and it's found in red bone marrow. So you may think that bone always is white, but when it's fresh from the body, it's actually quite red because it does have so much red blood cells being produced, especially in the proximal and distal epiphyses. Those are the ends of the long bones. And then we also find that in adults we have less red bone marrow than in children. So when you go ahead and look at a long bone in a child, their red bone marrow is going all the way throughout their bone, whereas in an adult that red bone marrow actually turns to yellow marrow, which is just adipose or fat tissue found in the middle of the bone called the medullary cavity. Note again, this is all in long bones, and there's a couple different types of bones. And we find it in the spongy bone, so it's in the little spaces in between the calcium matrix in the bone. So it's found in the femurs, the skull, the ribs, the sternum, the clavicles, and the vertebrae. So if our body needs more blood, then that red bone marrow is going to produce it, or it'll even transform the yellow marrow back into red bone marrow if we're still not getting enough red blood cells. The last one is pretty cool. Our body stores inorganic salts like calcium. It also stores other things like magnesium and phosphate. It also stores sodium and potassium and carbonate ions. And interestingly enough, back in the 20s, there were women who painted using radium, which is radioactive and glows. And they actually would lick the tips of the paintbrushes to get a finer line as they were painting, and they ingested radium. And our body, as it looks at radium, sees the same structure as calcium, so it actually stored the radium in their bones. And eventually these women died because their bones were just falling apart because it wasn't calcium and didn't provide the same structure. So you want to make sure that you put those notes into OneNote underneath the labs again, and make sure you've clicked into your specific OneNote and you're not in my content library. Otherwise you won't be able to write on it. So you want to make sure that when you're looking through the case studies to see if you can figure out which one of those functions that we just went through might apply to those case studies. And now as you're moving through OneNote, you're going to notice that we have some structures that I want you to know. And I would like you to actually draw these out on your own and label them, color them. Feel free to make flashcards or use Quizlet. Just look for microscopic structures of the bone or labeling a long bone. You can also find a lot of this information in our power focus area for the skeletal system as you're learning these different structures. So one of the things that I want you to note with the long bone, again, is that we have a center shaft called the diaphysis, And then we have two ends, both called epiphyses or epiphysis. The proximal is closest to the body and the distal is farthest away from the point of attachment. We also have at the end of each long bone this articular cartilage that is there because it's very, very low friction, and so it allows, as the bones connect or articulate together, it allows them to easily slide across each other so there's not friction there and thus not heat production or then pain. And you'll notice that the spongy bone is at the ends of the bones or in the epiphyses, and then the compact bone is mainly in the diaphysis and around the outer edge of the bone. We also have something called an epiphyseal line. You may have heard of this as the growth plate. This is also towards the end of the bone. This is where bone is produced as we're getting older, and then when we are finished growing, it turns into the epiphyseal line. So when we're younger, it's called a growth plate. You can actually break it and cause a disruption in the growth of your bone on that end, unless you have surgery done to realign it. We also have something called the periosteum, which goes around all the way around the outside of the bone, and it is made up of these perforating fibers and nerve vessels. So that's what's gonna let you know that you've stubbed your toe. All that pain is coming from the periosteum. Then we have the medullary cavity that's filled up with yellow bone marrow in adulthood and red bone marrow when we're young. And that yellow bone marrow is actually quite a delicacy because it is fat. People like to eat it. And then some other things that we want to note here is the endosteum, which is the inner portion of the bone lining the medullary cavity. So that's that first picture. As you scroll down that second one, you're going to see the ligament and tendon. Note that a ligament is what connects bone to bone, and a tendon is what connects the bone to the muscle. So as you are getting ready to draw this out, you will notice after you get done looking at the pictures in the skeletal system lab that you've got a task. So you can either use Play-Doh, whatever you have at home you can use. You can also just draw this out, but I want you to draw two different models, one of an entire long bone and one of a section of the long bone, including both compact and spongy bone. And you'll see that there's a table below, and I've highlighted specific terms because at the end of your drawings I want you to choose 3 of the highlighted structures for each of your models. So you'll have a total of 6 selected structures. And I want you to discuss how each structure, if not present, would affect homeostasis in the body. So remember, homeostasis is balance, and that's what we want to be at if we want to be healthy. And I want you to be as specific as you can, referencing the structure's function and then the overall affected function of the skeletal system. So your explanation should be at least 2 sentences per structure. So you're going to have 12 sentences minimum. Okay, so 2 sentences per each structure, and you have 6 total, 3 for the long bone model and then 3 for the microscopic section of compact and spongy bone. All right. So before you get to that, just going back up to our pictures, I'm on the 3rd picture now where we can see that this is a femur bone. We can see the articular cartilage on the outside and then the spongy bone with the red bone marrow in between the spaces. We can see the epiphyseal lines. There's 2 there. And then the marrow cavity, also known as the medullary cavity, that contains the yellow bone marrow. All right. So our second model that you're going to make is of compact bone and spongy bone. So in particular, you're gonna do the compact bone there. You'll see that we've taken kind of a slice and it zooms really in close. And you're going to notice that there's portions of the bone on the outer side that are going to be compact bone and then spongy bone that is towards the inner portion of the medullary cavity. So I want you to notice a couple of structures. These crop circle looking things, that first one's they're called Osteons, and they're actually the functional units of the bone, of compact bone in particular. And so you'll notice that there's all these crop circles that then in the middle we have this thing called an osteonic canal that contains blood vessels and nerves. So we have a bunch of these all mushed together there. And I want you to notice that those concentric circles, those crop circles, actually have these little spider veins that go in between them. And the little spaces that you see, those little holes, or they kind of look like red dots, those are actually bone cells. So we call bone cells osteo, meaning bone, and then cyte for cell, so osteocytes. And those little spider veins or legs going out from each of those little red dots are actually these things called Canaliculi. or Canaliculus for singular. And they're basically canals, okay? So they connect each of the bone cells or osteocytes. They connect each of the osteocytes to each other so that eventually they actually are all the way connected to the osteonic canal in the middle that has the blood vessels and the nerves. And we know that blood is responsible for carrying oxygen to cells and then taking away that carbon dioxide. So that's really important for us as we're thinking about this, just because of the fact that we need to have oxygen going to these cells. And so the canaliculi allow for oxygen to pass in between this cement matrix. So remember, essentially, your bone is just cement with a bunch of living cells inside of it. And so each of those little osteocytes are actually sitting inside of a little space, or a pit in Latin called a lacuna. So you're going to see those all throughout. The last thing that I want you to note is the trabeculae, which is actually for the spongy bone, which has the same structure essentially as an osteon, and you'll see that those osteocytes still are sitting inside a lacuna and have canaliculi connecting them together, and then reaching out to the outer sides of the trabeculae so that they're still receiving oxygen from the localized blood vessels there. And so the last picture we have is of an osteon, showing the 3 different types of bone cells that we find. So the osteocyte is a mature bone cell that first actually starts out as an osteoblast. You'll notice that all the little blue cells around the outside of the osteon are osteoblasts, and those are the ones that have a blast making new bone cells. That big glob one called an osteoclast, they actually clash bone, so they break it apart. And so that's what our body does when we need calcium in the blood. So our blood has to have a certain amount of calcium so that our muscles can actually contract. So calcium is really important for muscle contraction. So if we don't have enough calcium, you're not maybe eating enough calcium in your diet, right? Then your body is going to actually break down that cement matrix that has calcium in it, because it stores inorganic salts, right? Our bone does that. And it's going to release it into the blood. When we have enough in our bloodstream or too much, then the osteoblasts are going to go ahead and lay down more matrix, more of that calcium matrix, more cement. They're putting in more cement in each of those osteons, and potentially can fill all the way around themselves. Osteoblasts will fill all the way around themselves so that they actually are encased in a cement little block. And as they've become encased, then they turn into an osteocyte. And are just a mature bone cell inside of the calcium matrix. So those are all the different structures that you need to know. The big thing that I want you to note is the ones that I have highlighted in yellow have a specific job that has to do with functions we talked at the beginning. So you want to make sure you do a drawing for yourself. When you're done drawing or modeling with clay and labeling all these things, I would love for you to take a picture of your model. I need you to take a picture of your model and then post it into OneNote, or you can post it into Summit for this specific project. Once you finish your model, then you're going to write your explanation, 12 sentences minimum, and then that's going to be all that you have to do for today. So please feel free to email me if you have questions, or use Remind, whichever works best for you. Bye.